won't bother introducing all my titles. You can read about them in the bio. Instead, I'll talk to you a little bit about how I got into residency. But the minute I had a chance to do research, I knew what I wanted to research. I wanted to know what had happened, and I wanted to understand it. And I wanted to understand it without throwing out my Western science and training, but at the same time without reducing it to something trivial or something to be explained as something else. So I began my research in the mystical traditions and meditation. And first started with meditation because that sounded a lot better to me than renunciation or service. And proceeded from there to gradually build up a model for what's going on and why. And then a few years ago, I was invited to present a paper at a conference the Fetzer Institute was holding on the spiritual heart of service. I hadn't thought much about it before, but I suddenly saw how a lot of ideas could come together and make some sense out of certain phenomena from people who do service. It was a very inspiring conference because we heard from people who had done the sort of thing that I'll be describing today. And listening to their reports, I decided I wanted to investigate it further. I wanted to check out my ideas. So I interviewed about 24 people whose lives had service as a major focus, to ask them what had happened and also to check out my ideas. Now, it's very dangerous to check out your ideas with actual clinical data, but I did. And fortunately, they agreed with me. So there was no big problem in that respect. But it was very interesting because three main points emerged from that. And I'm going to be making use of interview material during this, so excuse me as I skip back and forth in a way. Now, the first point that struck me was that they said they received more than they had given. Well, that's a nice statement, and we can all say, yeah, I guess that's so. But I said, why? You know, what's the more that they received? How could that work in that way? And let me describe an interview of a man who helped to found an organization caring for AIDS sufferers. He contributed a large amount of time and financial resources and efforts to the project. And he said he had received more than he'd given. When I asked him about that, he said the following: in the caregiving work itself, when I truly connect with the other person, what happens is something about healing the separation I feel in my own life and the separation I believe we are all born into. The connection with that person feels like a tremendous gift, a kind of union that I want more of in my life, not only in service encounters, but in relationships outside the normal connection of possibilities, personalities, outside of social norms. Something deeper is happening that I crave considerably, only aware of it when the need starts to get filled, like a hungry person being weak, but unaware of the source of the hunger. And then food shows up. Ah, that's it. It all takes the form of my being the best person I can be, of my deepest humanity being expressed in this way. This is why I am here. Here is the answer to the question, what am I here for? What is the purpose of my life? Nothing else I do elicits the feeling of, yeah, this is it. He's a happily married man, lives in a nice house in Oakland. He's not suffering in any way, as far as I can tell. Now, the second point that came up a lot was that the people who do service in the right way, and I'll be talking about that later, experience a sense of connection to the person they're working with and to something larger, is the way they put it. I'll give you an example of that. This is a woman who works in a variety of capacities, providing assistance for the elderly and disabled in Marin County, where I live. I asked her to tell me about a situation where she felt that sense of connection most vividly. She described a visit she made to a children's hospital. She had taken a tiny puppy from the Humane Society with her, and she says, there was one room that I thought was on my list to go in, and there was a little boy sitting there on the bed. He kind of looked up at me, and I said, hi, I brought a puppy to visit with you. Would you like to play with this puppy? He kind of looked at me, and I said, he really likes to run and play. If you can get out of bed, you can play with him if you want to. I put the puppy down, and pretty soon the kid got out of bed, and he was on the other side of the bed, and we started with this game with the puppy, back and forth under the bed, and he was laughing and playing, and it was just joyful. I was supposed to spend 10 minutes there, and I guess I was there before 20 to 25 minutes. So then I said, I really have to take this happy puppy and visit with some other kids, but I'll come back and see you with another puppy at another time if you'd like that. Yeah, he said. So I walk over and say to the kid, would you like to pet this puppy and hug him goodbye? I put my arm around the kid, hugged him tight. I gave him a kiss. Kid gets in bed. I walk out the door, and there's 3 nurses and a couple of doctors standing there. They said, were you in that room? Yes, for 20 minutes. Wasn't I supposed to be there? They said, no, nobody's allowed to go in there. This kid's been in the hospital since he was 4 months old. He's had many surgeries. This child, they couldn't touch him. If you walked in the room, he'd react and scream. He was totally isolated. They said, did you speak to him? Were you allowed to touch him? They were just blown away that I'd walked into this room and blindly, no cue that I had a problem here, walked in and had this child with this incredible normal sort of reaction. The little boy and I were laughing, and we were in the same place of sheer joy over this little puppy who was just galloping between us, just completely full of life and energy and his little babyhood kind of thing. And that child and I were in the same place, and the kid knew it. He wouldn't have allowed it otherwise. Certainly the dog was the tool that got me in the door, but that little boy allowed me to touch him. There was a connection, for one thing, where he hadn't connected apparently with doctors and nurses and others who were around. The connection drops my sense of agenda. When I'm with him, I wasn't thinking, this is therapy for this child. It's just a sense of being in that moment, being on the same emotional plane. Now, there was a third important aspect of these interviews. They said there was a right way and a wrong way to do service. Perhaps wrong is too strong a word, but the usual way of doing service is very limited. That's where you consciously do good. Here's a problem that someone needs my help. I'll go to him, I'll help, etc., etc. That's not the way the process works best, and it's not the way you get that sense of connection. Now, a physician, this is Nancy, who established a medical clinic in Tibet, said, there's 3 kinds of people. I don't know if I can say it right. There's the one who's walking on the beach. He sees a beer can on the beach, and he looks around to make sure that everybody's watching, and picks up the can and throws it away. The second kind of person is walking on the beach, sees the beer can thrown on the beach, but there's nobody around. But he still picks it up and throws it in the garbage because he knows God is watching. Then there's the third kind of person who's walking along the beach, sees the beer can, throws it in the garbage, and doesn't care who is watching just because that's what needs to be done. I guess it's that third kind of motivation that's not ego-directed that one seeks. It's hard to get there. I call that in this paper serving the task. Okay, now, when I talk about connection for the rest of this time, I'm going to talk with the assumption, what I'm suggesting is that the connection is real. It's not just a nice fuzzy feeling inside someone or a football team getting together, yay, or something like this, but there is actually a connection. In fact, I think the spiritual experience is the experience of the connectedness underlying reality. And that seems to match most of the things that I've studied. So the connection we're talking about here has a definite spiritual analogy, not analogy, equivalent. Okay. So I'm going to read a few more selections having to do with connection, because although I don't have laboratory data, as you hear the stories, it becomes very compelling, and the rather trivial explanations that people offer for these phenomena just don't seem to make much sense. Now Now, there's a man, Wayne Muller, who founded something called Bread for the Journey, a group that practices small, informal philanthropy. He used an analogy to try and verbalize the experience. It's like a sympathetic vibration, like two tuning forks that are both tuned to 440 cycles per second, and if you hit the A on the tuning fork, the other will start to vibrate. And in that sympathetic vibration, you might go away and get one lesson from it. And I might go away taking another lesson from it, but those moments we were in the same place. There's something really quite nourishing about that for me. To be in the same place as another being. I think both of us come away tasting of something that would be difficult to nail down, but it's always there. Now here's a quote from a man who manages a residential hotel for the homeless, a former addict. He says, bringing one's identity and soul into congruence with somebody else so that you feel their need in a way that they may not even yet feel it, and by bringing it back to them, they begin to realize it. For me, the experience of service is the experience of attunement, of deliberately and meaningfully tuning yourself to be with other people who are not you. That attunement meant for him that he could recognize a need that wasn't being verbally expressed. He went on to say, I once fed a man who had been on methamphetamine for many days, and the simple act of eating with him was enough to provoke an astonishing sense of connectedness. He began to get better from then on. There were other factors involved, but I recognized he was starving. He was starving for something to eat and for someone to eat with. And I had the sense that if I was able to provide those things with him, he would get better, and he did. Now, sometimes the experience is more dramatic. A man who had a Zen Buddhist hospice said, 2 weeks ago I woke up from a dream of shortness of breath, drowning. Just woke up in the middle of the night. My pager went off. A patient here had just died, a respiratory illness. So that kind of experience happens. I don't know always what to make of that. Is it me being worried about this particular person and why he's going to die? Is it my fear of this way of dying? Or is it some attunement that's going on at that particular moment? I don't know. I only know that the experience happens. Another example is given by a woman who developed an organization providing services to the poor, the uneducated, recovering addicts, and alcoholics. She said, I had a friend, Doug, that I cared for a long time. He was dying. I wasn't in the house when he died, but I knew the second he had died, I picked up the phone and I called. His lover, Chris, picked up the phone and I said, Doug's dead, right? He said, yes. He just died a couple of minutes ago. First I was scared. I was really scared. But then I was so joyful that I had felt that moment that now I didn't have to grieve or be sad or anything, for I was in that breath with him when he took that last breath. And that was when I stopped being afraid of death. Now, a physician who founded an organization that provides support for cancer patients and education for doctors who care for them, said that she knows when something is really service. It's a sense of connection that you have to something beyond the moment when you do that. It's like seeing yourself and another as part of a much larger process that has no beginning and no end. Now, there are many reports of that. And if we have time, I can read more to you. They're really very amazing and inspiring when you're talking face-to-face to someone who tells you about these things. But the question comes up, why? And how is that related to serving the task, for doing things in the right way, for service in the right way? And for that, I have to digress a bit and talk about the way we develop our consciousness. If you look at the cognitive studies of how infants develop, you see that their first task is to be able to survive. And to do that, they have to be able to relate to objects. They have to learn that if an object is here, you can't put something else there. If an object is behind a mirror, After a while, they learn to pick it out. They learn language that way. The mother holds a ball, and the baby says, ball, ball, and reaches for it. Everything gets coordinated around being able to deal with objects. Consciousness becomes shaped to deal with objects. It's an object-derived view of the world. Now, we usually don't realize that the space and time and activity of which we're generally conscious is that of objects, and there's more than objects. For instance, try and visualize the universe coming to an end. Try it now. I don't think you can do it. Now try and visualize the universe not coming to an end. I don't think you can do that either. And the reason is the universe is not an object. And our whole consciousness and our sense of space and time and everything is derived from the behavior of objects. Now that gives you some taste of the way in which your capacity to grasp reality has its limits. So we have an object-oriented consciousness, and we have an object-oriented self. Our notion of a self is as an object. Now, most of you have been involved in the spiritual traditions or read the mystical literature, know they're saying that's an illusion. And so it's an illusion, yeah, that's right. It's an illusion. But there's a fine cartoon. You're getting a downward view of the Santa Maria, I guess, with Columbus on it there in the ocean. And it says, the private doubts of Christopher Columbus. And he's saying, it sure looks flat. It's very hard to get away from the object, self as an object. And yet it's that and it's something else. So what is there that can enable you to accept a different view of things? And is there a different kind of consciousness? And I'd like to demonstrate that again, if I may. Starting with the people on the right-hand row, go to the person next to you as your partner. Okay, and just pair off. You might have to cross aisles, I don't know. But you need someone to look at for this. You satisfactorily paired off? Anyone without a partner? If you get stuck, I'll be your partner.
You need a partner? Okay. I'm three. Fine.
We have three. We need one more over here.
You need one more, but you two and then you two.
But he's...
Oh, you can't. Sorry. I'm here. Got it.
Now, the first thing I want you to do is to look at your partner as if you were going to make a sketch or a model of their face. Notice how the planes operate, the proportions, the coloring. Scan it carefully. See what shape it is, how you would draw it, what you would do. Do that a little bit. Now I want you to shift your intention. Now I want your intention to be to take in and receive your partner. To let your partner's face be whatever it wants to be. And just be open to it. Okay. Most people notice a difference. You can stop now. And most people use words like deeper, richer, more profound to describe the more receptive experience where they're letting things happen, allowing things to happen. let's do it again. Some different instructions. Look at your partner again. And this time, maintain a very clear sense of self-awareness. There you are, sitting there looking at your partner. Keep that sense of self nice and clear and strong. Now let that sense of self subside, diminish, disappear from awareness. Okay. You can stop now. These more receptive experiences are much more satisfying. Most people find. Again, I hope, suggested there was a difference that you could notice, even in this hotel room. Usually what people find is that the shift, the dropping of self-awareness ends up with a broader sense of what the other person is, a different kind of perception. And what I suggest is that your intention and your self-awareness, self-concern, determines the mode of consciousness you have for purely functional reasons. I mean, you've got to survive in this world. You've got to be able to manipulate objects. You've got to be able to do all these sorts of things. So that's our first task of survival, and we have a mode of consciousness that serves that function. Well, that does create a problem, you might say. That leads us straight to the social biologists who say there's no altruism at all, because everything you do is selfish. If it gives you pleasure, that's more selfishness. If you sacrifice yourself, that's for your kin down the road, as it were. So it's all self-interest, you see. But it's not really true, because there are a lot of instances where that doesn't happen at all. There was a study of a village in France that the whole town sheltered and saved the Jews in it from the Nazis. And when asked about it, they said, well, what else could we do? It had to be done. When told they were heroic, they would say, it's not heroic, it's just, we had to do it, that was the need. They were serving a task, and they had a different experience and connection. So, what is involved in escaping from the self-trap? How can you do that? How can you get a different mode of consciousness? How can you lower the intensity of self-concern so that you're open to a different kind of mode? And that's where serving the task comes in. Now there's a very nice Sufi story of a man who went to a teacher, Sufi, and said, I'm waiting for God to tell me what I should do. And the Sufi says, you see that plant? It needs water. How loud does God have to shout? This is the position that almost all of us are in. Now let me read some sections pertaining to serving the task and how that gets expressed. Again, we have Nancy commenting on the distinction between self-consciously doing good and serving the task. Quote, there's a lot of things that motivate people for so-called altruism. One's intentions to be altruistic have to be very well examined, because otherwise it's about ego. It's not about altruism. Ego has to do with attachment to outcome. It has to do with attachment to how you will be viewed as a result of your behaving in that fashion. And it can lead to some very pathologic behavior. Some of the roughest times I've had are with people who beg to come with me to Tibet to help the poor Tibetans, and have ended up to be total psychopaths. They lost sight of what was going on, and it was all about them feeling their insatiable need to be worthy, not to be consoled that what you did was good, that it was good to do that. They say, no, I haven't done enough. I need to do more. Then it becomes ego and competition. What does it mean to do what is called for? What's this call? I use an analogy that my wife is so tired of hearing, I hardly dare to say it again, but I will anyway. It's a carpenter finishing a chair he's built. And he may finish the underside of the chair, even though it doesn't affect the price, and someone else may not care about it, but it seems called for by the integrity of the chair. So he does what is called for in that sense. I once asked Rachel, a woman who founded a caring place for terminal people and to train doctors, I asked her to comment from her own experience on the nature of the call to which the carpenter was responding. She said, I would say that the carpenter does the underside of the chair to honor the task. The task has integrity because it is seen as connected to something much larger. That something else is important enough, holy enough to him that it requires him to do the best he knows. Now, Charles Garfield, whom I quoted earlier, makes a similar distinction. A self-conscious, highly moralized, doing good is very far from the place that I recognize as valuable. When I'm more self-consciously helping, it's usually because I'm in a survival mode. What's going through my mind is fundamentally different. Whereas in true service, I'm not serving myself. There's not that aspect to it, or wanting to get brownie points for heaven. Doing what needs to be done is the way I used to say it to the volunteers. There's an extension of self that occurs, an extension of myself to include the other person. What's in his best interest is in my best interest. Page number here wrong for a minute. Just bear with me a second. Now, Mary Kate told me of a time when she was working in a bus station, an outreach program for homeless people with mental illness. I was working with a very part-time assistant who had been a client of mine, who really wanted an opportunity to both have a professional position and also to give something to the community itself. He was very articulate and engaging. He decided that his domain was going to be donations, clothing, food, whatever. I just said, cool, take care of it. You're good at that. Go for it. I was working with a woman who was in her 60s. Although she looked like she was in her 80s. She'd been homeless for 20 years. And because there was no pressure in our shelter and no requirements for people to give up their names or anything else, it just felt really good to people. And this older woman who refused to stay anywhere else in any other shelters went and stayed there. We were all just delighted. It was like victory. Great. My assistant found her a special coat and a special hat just for her, and with great ceremony gave it to her. And she took it and slept on it and didn't say thank you. He was shocked. He was stunned. He was hurt. And he said, well, aren't you going to say thank you? She rose up out of this pallet that she had made out of the coat and said, my mother thanks you. My father thanks you. My grandmother thanks you. They all say, kiss my ass. He was just stunned. He expected to be rewarded for his goodness. She read him clearly, and it was so beautiful. It was such a beautiful lesson in this expectation. When one does good consciously and willfully, one expects to be rewarded, as opposed to simply doing what is to be done. And there is an enormous difference. She goes on to talk about how this woman taught her some things too in the same way. Now one more. This was an organizational consultant for socially active groups. She emphasized the importance of a match between the task and the person, a match that eventually frees them from too much concern with outcomes. What energizes me is a sense of inner calling of where the match between who I am, what my soul's longing is, and the outside needs. So it's a kind of meeting there, and it may not all work out. It doesn't have to achieve some absolute goal. I don't really think in those terms. I just know that this is what I ought to be doing, whether or not it works out. It's nice when it does, but it's not necessary. I do it because I want something to happen. Now, when you start talking about service to people, you become aware that there's a lot of confusion about the topic. Service, as we're taught it, as most people are taught it, gets mixed up with moral issues. Service is what good people do. If you're good, you do service. If you don't, you feel guilty. People who really serve the most are saints, like Saint Teresa. And so if you want to go heal the lepers or take care of the dying, that's okay, but that's really what you need to do. And if you don't, you feel a little guilty and uneasy. It's very uncomfortable, and you begin to resent the burden of that obligation. Or you start doing it and you get grandiose, self-flattering, and a real pain to everyone else around you. So it can be a real problem as to how to deal with that, as long as you think of service in that way. That is an obligation, a responsibility. And then people almost immediately ask about burnout. And it's true, burnout occurs. But according to these people that I interviewed, burnout is a function of what kind of helping you're doing. If you're doing the kind where you're going to fix everything up and you're going to heal the other person, that gets disappointed and that gets burned out. Let me read some examples of... This is a woman who set up a organization that cares for the needy and addicts and whatever. And she reflects on how she began. And she had been an addict herself. I was crazy before. I started to act like and do things very similar to what I was experiencing because the experience was so profound that it affected me in a really horrible way. I wasn't accepting it. I tried to fix it all the time, and then finding out that I couldn't fix it, and then beating myself very, very badly. I believed that you had to work with so many people in so much time and make them all well. Now it's not like that. Now I can work with 10 times more people, and I'm not responsible to make them well. I can just walk with them and see if we can't both get to a slightly better place. Rachel writes, over time, fixing and helping are draining and depleting. Over time, we burn out. Real service is renewing. When we serve, our work itself will sustain us. Jason talked about the resurgence of expectations that affect every service provider. He says, I had great expectations and great desires for positive outcomes, and you almost have to work through all of that before you can be any good at it at all. It is to be in that expectation place repeatedly and have the expectation place jump up and bite you. To say eventually, oh, this is my old friend, this expectation. Now I see that it is expectations that are setting me up again, yet again. Gosh darn it, I thought I'd exacerbated the old devil, but I haven't. Extinguished the old devil? Not exacerbated. So there it is. Pat it on the head and send it back to its little corner to lie down. But there are some people who serve by contributing. And John, a man who's a consultant to inheritors of wealth, suggested a good criterion of wise philanthropy is that the donor of money feels gratitude toward their clients. Quote, when we give judiciously, we neither expect nor want to be thanked. When we contribute to an organization, we are employing people to do what we believe should be done, what we want to be done. If we find that we desire expressions of appreciation, this probably indicates that our giving is wrong. not reflective of our deepest and strongest values, not to the right organization or people to carry these out, or possibly our motives are inappropriate, such as seeking prestige. Now, these people that I interviewed were really quite inspiring, and not the least because they manifested so little pride or vanity about what they were doing. There was no air of self-importance. If I had not asked them about their experiences, they wouldn't have talked about them. Their personalities differed a lot. Some were more articulate than others, some more interiorly focused, others less so, but their reports were strikingly similar in attitude and the experience of connection. These are people who have developed the capacity to serve the task. Now, the question that people end up often is, what should I do? Where do I go? What do I do? What should I do? How much should I do? This kind of thing. And there's some nice discussions of that. I better skip that one. Excuse me just a minute. All right, these are the comments of a woman who's a massage therapist. She goes around with a van, the homeless areas, and asks people if they want a massage. And they do. She says, in answer to the question, what should I do? Do what makes you happy. You don't have to worry about what you are doing. You don't have to worry about how much you can or have to give or don't have to give. If you're happy serving up soup, it's the happiness more than the soup that person is going to be nourished by. What makes you happy? You better think about it before you go out there. Really examining what makes you happy and do that. And the thing is that if it makes you so happy, that will be what propels you to do it again. Because oftentimes people think of service as, oh, this is something I should do. And that's bullshit. If it's something you should do, then there's an obligation that's connected with it. I mean, service should be free. That quality of freedom to give, to be able to give unconditional love to another human being is not something that I should do because you're my partner. If it gets to that point, I really need to look at this relationship. There's nothing that kills the relationship faster than I should be doing this. This doesn't mean that happiness is not without its sadness. I'm happy with what I'm doing. But it doesn't mean I can't just be drenched in the sadness of the situation that I encounter or of who I encounter. Happiness doesn't mean giddiness. It's like a crackling fire inside you. I like to see people start with what makes you happy and smile. That's the greatest act of service that you can give to these people. When I give on the streets, nobody wants to look at them. I mean, the police are forever sweeping them away. People coming down the street think, I don't want to look at you. You make me uncomfortable. You might ask me for something. Many of the homeless people say, my God, you looked at me. When we're in embrace, when we were touching, you get to look for an extended period of time. That's the beauty of this, of having a way to practice it. That's the beauty of the work that I do. It's that it gives people. It's one thing to sit in the classroom and think about these things, or read a book about these things, but here is something that you can feel. You have a lot to give, but you don't have to give a lot. All it takes is just a little. Think small. Yeah, think small. I need an executive assistant. Anybody see that as a need that should be filled? Or make you happy? One of the questions that comes up is, if service is so hot, can Adolf Hitler be served and give you the same experience? Can evil be served? I don't think so. Because service also involves doing something that you feel is beneficial. It's very hard to hurt someone else. You can't do it and maintain connection. Now, I'm not just saying this. Try it out. You have your partner. Look at your partner. You too. Be open and receptive. Try once more. And again, be open to your partner. Allow your partner's presence to come out to you. Let it be whatever it is. And now I want you to imagine picking up a knife and stabbing your partner. What did you notice? What happened? Connection is absolutely antithetical to violence. You can't, if you did go through with that in imagination, you had to break the connection and step back, as it were, to do that. The same applies to violence done to children. Brant Steele, who was a great child psychologist, said what we're always dealing with is a lack of empathy. Empathy is connection, essentially. Service must necessarily be generous, beneficial in intent, in order to open the gates of perception. The more the ego, what I call the survival self, can subside, can cease to dominate consciousness, the wider the gates can open. People who are truly serving the task experience something they cannot name, something that does answer the big questions. Who am I? What am I? They do not ask what is the meaning of life, because the question no longer arises. The answer is implicit in the experience of connection which service makes possible. The experience of a service enlarged by connection and freed from its object goals, participating in something larger and intrinsically meaningful. This broadening and this deepening of perception is something that is earned. It arises as a consequence of the forgetting of the self that service makes possible. I think we'll stop there and we can start taking some questions.
I came because I have always had a bent towards service, and now that I'm retired, it's much easier. But the difficulty that I had was when I was in a role as an employee. And you were talking about the foundation people who were going to hire the folks who were going to do the service, but there are expectations on the part of the people who engage you. And that, I think, was a difficult thing for me. Now I have no problem with outcome. Mm-hmm. But as a paid person, it puts a burden on you for some outcome. And that was a struggle I never solved.
Did your experience fit with what I've been talking about, or did it contradict it?
No, my experience absolutely fits in that one of my volunteer roles was a hospice volunteer. And I was totally a volunteer.
Yes.
And I did what was needed. And it felt fine. But as an employee in a service agency, there are expectations. You can say, I have no expectations for outcome, But that can be a condition of
Yeah.
employment, almost in every, service realm.
What my hope would be that this model, this concept of serving the task would become more widespread, so people would see that that is indeed the attitude that is productive, saves you from burnout, enables you to be energized by what you're doing rather than just depleted. Does anyone else have any experiences in terms of the service issue that they could add? Someone's going to talk now.
Well, I was wondering if you might be willing to share with us something about your mystical experience that set the stage for your research and where you are now.
Okay. I'd finished with college, and I was supposed to go canoeing up in the Adirondacks with a friend of mine, but I forget which war was going on at the time, but he was concerned about the draft, and so he wouldn't go. So I went by myself, and I camped for 2 months on this lake in the Adirondacks. And I tried to struggle with why I was dissatisfied in my life, what it was I really wanted, what was going on, what should I do. And I came to the conclusion that there was a source of something that I wanted in music and arts and literature, and there was something out there and I needed to get closer to it. So every day for about a half hour I'd sit on a rock by the side of the lake and close my eyes and try and reach out in some blind way to whatever it was. I didn't call it meditation. I didn't know what meditation was. That's what I was trying to do, to make closer contact with whatever it was out there. And after a couple of weeks, my perception started to change. The details of things became brighter. But most important of all, I felt an emanation coming from the sky and the trees and the water. It was intrinsically valuable. I knew I wanted more of it. I knew it was important. It didn't solve all my problems. I was still lonely by the lake. And I made a note to myself, don't romanticize this. But it was very important. I wanted to pursue the intuitive line, but no one knew what the hell I was talking about then. Someone told me to read St. John of the Cross, St. Augustine, which I did, but just when it seemed to get most relevant, the book ended. So that didn't help too much. But I didn't know how to pursue it further. I almost left medical school, but I continued with it. But when I had a chance to do research, I knew what I wanted to research. And I wanted to understand what it was that had happened and why. And so I began my studies. And I think I have a better understanding of it now, but I still have this object-oriented head, so it sets certain limits. There's a wonderful cartoon that shows 2 fish in a fish bowl. One fish is talking to the other, says, you can be anything you want. And there they are swimming inside this fish bowl, which they don't quite see. So our minds, to some extent, are swimming inside a fish bowl that we don't see. But this process of serving the task gives you a kind of exit, really does open the door, whereas other things don't. I like to use the metaphor of a businessman who gets dissatisfied with the result of making money. He reads about enlightenment, decides he wants enlightenment. So it sends instructions down to his control computer center in the brain and says, and the assistant down there gets the message and rushes over to the boss and says, what program do we run now? Change. He no longer wants money, he wants enlightenment. The boss says, same program, acquisition. And that plagues it. So you have spiritual teachers, the real ones or the effective ones, are faced with this problem. No one can come to them without being motivated by acquisitive aims. It's just about, they have to somehow find a way for that person to work through or not be so hampered by the acquisitive aims that they can be open to something different. That's why forget the self is a good way of thinking about the traditions. Not because the self is bad, we need it, it's vital, but it limits us, so we want to have other options. Anyone else want to give me more data? Whoops.
You won't get any data out of me, you'll get a question.
Okay.
First of all, I liked your whole presentation because it's very down to earth. I mean, in talking to people, that's being a person that doesn't talk a lot to people, it's very meaningful for me. But you said something that a lot of things that would hit me in the right place. The giving should feel like getting, I think, is one of your primary themes.
Yeah.
And this, therefore, is a no-lose situation. The thing that you didn't hit in, and I thought would be hopeful that you would to the answer to this question, we need a global answer, not necessarily today, but we need a global answer to the question of how do we improve human behavior. And so my question to you is, make it a little easier, is do you believe in reincarnation, and does that possibly fit into some of this?
Well, I don't like talking about reincarnation or heaven and hell or any of these things in connection with service, because it inevitably throws you into the commanding, well, the Sufis call it the commanding self, but essentially it activates the survival self, because the survival self is there to get you things, to get rewards, to avoid punishment. So the minute you set things up so that if I live a good life, I'll be reincarnated at a higher level, otherwise I'll be reincarnated as a snail, you have a big problem. But if it comes to, because you're always looking at your actions from that point of view. So I don't like, now, okay, you're shaking your head.
I think, you know, there's some truth in what you say. You're expecting a reward. But if there's really altruism in doing that, then you're not expecting a reward. You're just saying, this is the way the law is. Like if I drop this pad of paper, it's going to fall down on the ground.
Right.
That's the law. It's
and if
physics.
so
there are spiritual laws that we haven't, that you might be opening the doors to, that need to be addressed, just like there are physical laws that we've done a good job of addressing.
Can you give me an example?
Of a spiritual law?
Yeah.
One spiritual law is ones you've described. There is a spiritual law according to the great mystics. I'm not in that category. But the spiritual law says that when you give something, it comes back to you, and that's a fact of spiritual law.
Okay. In terms of what I've been talking about, I would say when you give in the right way, what comes back to you is your connection with the larger reality.
Yes.
That's what gets back.
Giving in the right way is a method of satisfying as a human being, you have a spiritual requirement when you came in here. You followed certain principles to come here. Spiritual principles. And as I say, this is the great mystery which so far our society is grappling with indirectly, I think.
Well,
but you are showing us an example how the spiritual law works.
When you talk about, everyone nowadays is concerned about the total situation. And the acts of violence that take place can only take place if other people are objectified, right? Boundaries between us and them are set up. And all of the, as far as I can see, all of the efforts to break down the barriers of violence and hostility have all tried to revolve around the same thing. Get people together long enough to find out that they're the same as each other. Let some kind of contact take place for real. And that's hard to do, but I don't see any other way to address the larger issues unless that takes place. Television could be very helpful if you had a less propagandized medium.
One way that the spiritual teachers address that issue is they call us brothers and sisters. The teacher is the brother and sister, and the person who is getting information is no different from the teacher.
Well, I agree.
So we are not separate objects. We are in the same family, so to speak.
Thank you.
Your talk about service is mostly about philanthropy in a general term. There are over half the people in this country who are in service industries. Can these people serve the task at their working jobs? And if so, can that be induced, that desire?
Well, the attitude I'm talking about, I think, is applicable anywhere. Doing the dishes, I mean, it doesn't, and that's what I believe a lot of Zen Buddhist teaching has to do with how do you live in that way. So it's this attitude of, as it were, experiencing a need, doing what needs to be done. If that activity is something that you feel is harmful, then that is a problem. In other words, if you're working for a company that is doing bad things as far as you're concerned, then your task may become, how do we shift the company policy? Or if I can't do that, where else can I work? I mean, you need something that says, oh yes, I'm using my life for this, because that's what you're doing. You're using your life, and it's, as Houston Smith pointed out, we do have this problem of thinking we're going to live forever, and we don't. So it's very important to be able to experience your response to things, to water the plant because it needs water. And if you do that with that open service attitude, I think you do feel connected, even at that slight level, even at that non-grand, non-dramatic level. It's a different position.
But this attitude is not widespread. Can it be induced? I guess that's my question.
Well, it's not widespread, but a lot of people have been trying to do something about it, starting with Moses. You got Moses, you got Buddha, you got, I should remember the list, Christ and Martin Luther King and Hildegard. No, it's a big problem. But the same thing comes up over and over again. That's why it helps to actually say, oh, this is the nature of the situation. We're born into this world. We're born with a brain that helps us to survive, but then we have other needs, and that same brain organized that way can't meet those needs. What do we do? How do we keep from how do we gain an option for the usual mode of consciousness that we have to meet other needs? Now you don't want to be at one with the universe all the time. You know, you're not going to cross the street in that way. So we need both these modes, but basically it's very hard for people to get in this serving the task mode because they're unfamiliar with it.
Thank you.
Hi, Arthur. Thanks for coming. I don't know quite how to put this in a question, but there's a conflict in my mind where I did a certain type of service for a few years, and it seemed very frustrating, and it really drained a lot of energy, took a lot of time, and it didn't seem to be accomplishing anything for anyone. And I switched service into something that is very gratifying. It seems to really be doing some good and helping. And in some ways it seems like, well, now my service work is really gratifying for me, and it feels really good. And I feel, some question as to where to go into service and how important is it to, like you're a doctor, you wouldn't go into service helping people dig caves, right? So it just, there's some conflict in me.
According to these people, I didn't read all the stuff I have, but they would say if at all possible, do something that you want to do, that in some way meets the capacities that you have, who you are. So you're not trying to force yourself into some different kind of position, but if at all possible, be serving, as you said, in a way that makes you happy. Didn't mean that in a trivial sense, but just energizes you, and it's doing what fits, what harmonizes it.
But there seems to be a fine line between that and going into self-gratification or something.
Well, let me say a word about that. You may serve the task and find pleasure in it, but pleasure is not your goal. Serving the task the pleasure is a consequence of that activity, and that's a big difference. Because otherwise people say, well, you got pleasure from it, so therefore that's why you're doing it. It's selfish. Not selfish.
Okay.
Doesn't have to be.
I've been doing service, but maybe in a more less way than people don't think. But our company believes, we serve pizza, okay?
Uh-huh.
And it's not necessarily the act of serving the pizza, just like the soup,
Right.
but it's the act of connecting with the people that you're serving. And I think how we can induce that is by our own example. And I am trying to look for tools, so I'm like taking everything down. I don't even work for them anymore, but they're my family. And but I am looking for tools to maybe give these tools to people because it's so intangible.
I didn't hear what you just said. Could you
I'm looking
repeat?
for tools to take back to, because I think people are yearning for that, but they just don't know how to get there, and they don't see the greater good of it. And like picking up the beer can on the beach, you're connecting to the greater task, like you said, of keeping the environment clean. And if you know that, you feel good that you're contributing to the greater task. But I'm looking for tools, and I'm wondering if you have in any of your books or any tools that we can take back, or
I have articles.
that would be
I have a
great.
website in which they're all there, and you can download from the website.
That'd be great.
And there's an article I published recently in the Journal of Consciousness Studies called A Functional Approach to Mysticism that touches on some of the issues I brought today.
Cool.
This website should be easy to remember, www.deikman.com. I might give you my email address if you were very judicious. Would anybody like it? That's at WorldNet. I don't know, it's .att.net. It's awfully long, I realize. Yes?
I have a question. I appreciated your lecture here this morning, and this workshop or this seminar was titled Service as an Altered State.
Yes.
Could you just kind of, in a nutshell, synopsize maybe the collective or the common altered state in which these people in your studies achieved a sense of whether it's serenity or bliss or oneness with God or whatever this altered state was connected with service?
Yeah, let me see if I can. Well, let's put it this way. The condition of receptive consciousness, if you want to put it that way, is one in which the self, there's an object self on one hand. On the other hand, there's another kind of self that's more diffuse, that's less localized, that is permeated more than grasping it all. Let me see if I can I got a chart here and I got a slide, but people usually can't read slides at lectures. Just a second, I may be able to. I know what to do. Okay, this is a representation of a big discordance in our experience life. There's now, and this plane, and what we might also call presence.
Right, a little bit larger.
Okay. Time, linear time, is on this axis, this plane. And the survival self operates in here. This plane is absolutely orthogonal. It doesn't intersect the one of now and presence. You experienced each other's presence to some extent when you were doing some of these exercises. Now this plane here, which is the ordinary one we're in, is a particular state of consciousness. It's a mode of consciousness, a way in which our experience is organized. This now place is very interesting because time just isn't there. You don't have linear time there. You have a different sense of things. This was very important for me at one point because I was told I had prostatic cancer and I was terrified. I'd read lots of spiritual books but didn't help at all. And I thought it would be terrible irony if whatever time I had left I used up in obsessing about death. I mean, that would be real bad. And I got out of that finally by focusing on the presence of the trees and the mountains and the now space like that. In that now space, all these other things, they still exist, but they're not part of your consciousness. Now, serving the task is something that tends to participate in this way. I mean, you're still using time to do this and that, but you're not grabbing it in the same way. Now, if you want details of the altered state, it's in the paper I mentioned. There's also another one called Bimodal Consciousness that was published in the 70s. You can download whatever you want from the... So these are all very practical matters. These are the things I'm talking about are not insubstantial. And what I'm working on now is a way of understanding how connection is real, external to each of us. How that could be, to, at the same time, not be accessible by the sensory system. Because I could say I'm connected to you, but where? What are we talking about? But there's something there. So that's the puzzle at the moment. I think we've run out of questions and maybe time. Thank you for sticking with me through all this.
Thank you.